St. Mary's Hospital, a silent transformation. St. Mary's Hospital, once a symbol of pride for the New York community, now functioned like a well-oiled yet soulless machine under the strict supervision of Janet Miller. Every protocol was followed to the letter, but no one on the staff felt genuinely inspired. The long, sterile hallways, lit by cold fluorescent lights, echoed with the hurried footsteps of doctors and nurses, accompanied by exhausted sighs. On a Monday morning, Janet conducted her routine inspection of the waiting area, clipboard in hand. As she approached the reception desk, she noticed an employee struggling to explain something to a man standing across from her. Janet frowned, her eyes landing on the bold red cap atop his head, emblazoned with the unmistakable words, MAGA. The man, dressed in a simple gray t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers, seemed entirely out of place in the hospital's professional environment. Janet strode toward the reception desk, her voice sharp. "What's going on here?" The receptionist hesitated. "He wants to walk around the hospital, to observe." I explained that we don't allow unauthorized visitors to roam freely, but before she could finish, the man smiled and interrupted gently. "I just want to understand how this place operates. No need to worry, I'm not here to bother anyone." Janet fixed her gaze on him, her tone unwavering. "This is a hospital, not a sightseeing attraction." Her eyes flicked briefly to his MAGA hat. "And that hat is not appropriate in a professional environment." Her voice grew sharper. "If you don't have a legitimate reason to be here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man remained calm, his smile never faltering. "Interesting. You bring up professionalism, but I guess surprises aren't really your thing, huh?" Janet scowled. "I don't need surprises. I need order, and our policies don't allow outsiders to wander around freely." The tension between them was palpable. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably, feeling the air grow thick. Finally, the man shrugged casually. "Fair enough. I don't want to cause any trouble." But just before turning away, he added, almost as an afterthought, "But don't let appearances deceive you." Janet watched him leave, unsettled by his calm demeanor. Another troublemaker, she thought, turning back to the receptionist. "Log his name and reason for being here. I don't want this happening again." The receptionist nodded, but as she glanced at the retreating figure, she couldn't shake the lingering feeling that something was off. Nearby, a younger staff member whispered to a colleague, "That looked like JD Vance." A second visit, and an unfolding mystery. Janet dismissed the strange encounter, returning to her office and burying herself in spreadsheets. The hospital's performance metrics filled her screen. Efficiency was high, revenue was stable, yet patient dissatisfaction was rising. But Janet ignored it. "We're still operating efficiently. That's what matters." Still, whispers spread like wildfire throughout the hospital. "Are you sure that was JD Vance? Who else wears a MAGA hat and stays that composed? He must be planning something big." If it's true, Janet's in for a bad day. But what they didn't know was that the man would return, and his presence would unravel everything Janet had built her beliefs upon. Tuesday morning, a revelation. Tuesday morning started like any other. Janet arrived by 7 a.m. sharp, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning every corridor to ensure order was maintained. But just as she reached the reception desk, she froze in her tracks. The man in the red MAGA hat was back, except this time he wasn't alone. Several members of the hospital staff had gathered, whispering amongst themselves. Janet felt anger rise in her chest. "Who let him in?" She strode forward, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. "What are you doing here?" The whispers ceased immediately. The surrounding staff instinctively took a step back, sensing the rising tension. The man, JD Vance, looked up from the paper in his hands and smiled. "Good morning." He held up a signed document as if he had every right to be there. "I just came back to finish what I started yesterday." Janet narrowed her eyes. "I made myself very clear yesterday." Her irritation only grew at his unwavering calmness. "You are not allowed to wander this hospital. This is not a place for sightseeing." Her voice lowered, sharp as a blade. "And that hat, I don't want to see it here." JD calmly removed the hat, holding it in his hand. "This hat bothers you, doesn't it?" He studied her reaction carefully. "But tell me, is it actually affecting the patients or the staff?" Janet crossed her arms, her grip on the situation slipping. "You're wasting my time." She glanced around, noticing several employees discreetly watching. Her voice remained firm. "This is a professional healthcare facility, not a venue for your personal ideas." JD tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharp yet almost amused. "You think I'm making a statement?" He let out a small chuckle. "That's interesting. I don't see observing and understanding how a system operates as a political statement." His voice lowered slightly, his eyes meeting hers. "Don't you think listening should always come first?" For the briefest moment, Janet had no response, but she quickly regained control. "You have no business here. If you don't have a valid reason, I'll have security escort you out." JD smiled again, showing no signs of defiance. Turning to the receptionist, he spoke calmly. "I apologize for any inconvenience I've caused. Thank you for your patience." But just before leaving, he turned one last time to Janet. His gaze, now sharper, held an undeniable weight. "You know," he paused. "The thing about systems is that we often focus so much on control that we forget they only truly work when they serve people." His voice softened slightly. "Thank you for reminding me of that." And with that, he walked out the front doors. Janet watched him go, feeling as if she had lost something she couldn't quite name. She took a deep breath, shoving the unsettling feeling aside. Turning back to the receptionist, her voice was sharp once more. "Record his name and his purpose for being here. I don't want this happening again." The receptionist nodded, but as she looked after JD Vance's retreating figure, she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming, a shocking announcement. Janet Miller was in the middle of reviewing reports when her phone rang. "Mrs. Miller, there's an emergency meeting in the main conference room at 3:00 p.m. All senior leaders are required to attend." Janet frowned, her worry growing. "What's this about? I didn't receive any prior notice." Her assistant hesitated before replying, voice trailing off. "The hospital's new owner has requested it, ma'am, and I think you should be prepared." Janet's heartbeat quickened slightly. A new owner? She had heard rumors about St. Mary's Hospital being acquired by a major corporation, but she never imagined it would affect her directly. Still, she gathered her documents and made her way to the conference room, reassuring herself, "It's probably just an orientation meeting. Nothing to worry about." The main conference room was brightly lit, and all senior leaders were already seated. Janet entered, her face a mask of calm authority. The sharp clack of her heels echoed on the polished floor. Her eyes scanned the room until they froze on the man sitting at the head of the table. Gone was the MAGA hat she had seen earlier. Now he wore a crisp suit, looking both polished and relaxed, a hint of humor flickering in his gaze. It was JD Vance. Janet's stride faltered momentarily, but she quickly regained her composure, walking to her seat as if unaffected by the murmurs and curious stares around her. "Why is he here? What does this mean?" she wondered, keeping her thoughts to herself. JD rose from his seat, his gaze sweeping across the room before he spoke. "Thank you all for coming. Allow me to introduce myself." His voice was calm but firm. "I'm JD Vance. As of last week, I'm officially the majority shareholder of St. Mary's Hospital." The room fell silent, as if the very air had been sucked out. Janet felt her heart skip a beat, then begin pounding faster. "What did he just say? Majority shareholder? St. Mary's belongs to him now," JD continued, his voice unwavering. "I didn't acquire this hospital because it's a valuable asset." He took a few steps forward, his piercing gaze missing nothing. "I believe the healthcare sector needs radical transformation. We can't allow an outdated system to continue burdening both staff and patients." He turned slightly, scanning the faces around him. "I want St. Mary's to become a symbol of change, a place where people come first." A hushed murmur spread through the room, then JD's tone shifted, sharper, more direct. "However, from what I've observed over the past 2 days, it's clear that not everyone here understands this vision." Janet's stomach tightened. He was looking straight at her. Some seemed more focused on control than on service. A heavy silence settled over the room. Janet felt every eye shift toward her. Her throat went dry, but she forced herself to maintain her outward composure. Inside, however, a storm of anger and confusion churned. "He's targeting me. Who does he think he is?" JD stopped walking and looked directly at her, his voice measured yet weighty. "Mrs. Miller." The room held its breath. "I've heard about your leadership style." He tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "You keep everything tightly managed, procedures followed to the letter. But let me ask you this." He paused. Then his voice dropped slightly, almost challenging. "Does your leadership make employees and patients feel heard?" Janet's grip tightened on her clipboard. She felt cornered. Taking a deep breath, she responded sharply. "Mr. Vance, I believe that strict procedures are the only way to run a hospital efficiently." Her voice was firm, unwavering. "We're doing the best we can in an incredibly challenging environment." JD nodded slightly, a faint knowing smile playing on his lips. "Efficient, perhaps." He crossed his arms, studying her reaction. "But does that efficiency translate into satisfaction? For patients? For staff? Or is it just numbers on your reports?" A wave of tension rippled through the room. Janet felt a surge of anger rise. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of her peers. "We've kept this hospital running for years." She forced herself to remain calm. "And it works just fine. I don't see any need for drastic changes." JD paused, his gaze sharpening even further. Then, in a voice low but firm, he asked, You don't see a need for change? A slight pause. Or, you don't want change. His eyes locked onto hers. Because if we don't adapt, you'll soon find that the current way of doing things no longer works. His words hung in the air. Then he turned slightly, his voice resolute. Remember, this hospital exists not just to operate. He let the silence stretch, then finished, voice steady. It exists to serve people. He returned to his seat. Then in a final brief but weighty statement, he said, Mrs. Miller, you have time to show that you can adapt. He paused, then added firmly, but know this, if you don't, I'll find someone who can. The room remained silent, Janet's lips pressed tightly together, humiliation simmering beneath the surface. But she said nothing, a moment of reckoning. As Janet walked out of the conference room, she felt the weight of every employee's gaze on her. The once familiar hospital corridors now seemed oppressively narrow. Her mind raced. No one has the right to dictate how I run things. We'll see who changes whom. She quickly headed to her office, trying to shake off the unease creeping into her thoughts. But as she closed the door behind her, her hands still gripping the clipboard, she knew she couldn't ignore what had just happened. JD Vance hadn't just challenged her authority, he had made her feel like the center of a much larger issue, one she had never fully acknowledged before. She sat at her desk, staring at her laptop screen. The hospital's performance numbers were still there, steady, reliable, efficient, yet something felt off. Negative feedback from staff and patients was rising. Employee resignations were increasing. Morale was at an all-time low. She had ignored these red flags, believing that efficiency was all that mattered. Her eyes landed on a framed photo in the corner of her desk. It was of her parents, taken on her medical school graduation day. She stared at her own younger, more hopeful face. And suddenly, her father's words echoed in her mind. You became a doctor, not just to be the best. You did this to help people. For the first time in years, Janet wondered, when did I forget that? A new beginning for St. Mary's Hospital. It was about reclaiming the person she once was. Janet set her pen down, her gaze resolute. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was heading in the right direction, a shift in the atmosphere. The next morning, St. Mary's Hospital was as busy as ever. Doctors and nurses rushed through the hallways, the sound of patients being called, the rhythmic hum of medical machines, and the hurried clatter of footsteps filled the air. But this time, Janet didn't just walk through. She paused, observed. She paused, observed. For the first time in years, she truly noticed the tired expressions, the urgency in people's eyes, the deep, weary kapans. How long have I ignored this, she wondered. She resolved to understand the challenges her staff faced. As she passed the reception area, staff members glanced at her. Some looked curious, others hesitant. She greeted a few of them, something she rarely did before. Some looked surprised, others skeptical. Trust won't be rebuilt overnight, but I won't stop trying. She made her way to the meeting room where the department heads were waiting. Inside, familiar faces, the head nurse, the chief physician, the administrative manager, looked at her expectantly. These were the people who had worked alongside Janet for years. Yet to most of them, she was just a strict manager, not a teammate. But today, things would be different. She sat down, no clipboard, no reports, just a notebook and an open mind. I want to hear from you. Her voice was calm, unexpected. Tell me what's really happening. What changes do you need to work better? The room fell silent. The department heads exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, Mark Robinson, the youngest doctor in the group, spoke up. The workload is overwhelming, he admitted. We're asking nurses and doctors to work around the clock without adequate rest. I've seen colleagues burn out. Some have left because they just couldn't handle it anymore. Emily Turner, the head nurse, nodded. We've raised this issue several times. We understand resources are limited, but if this isn't addressed, the staffing shortage will only get worse. Janet listened attentively, taking careful notes. She didn't interrupt. She didn't dismiss their concerns. A stark contrast to her usual approach. Her demeanor surprised the room. For the first time, they felt heard. The meeting lasted longer than usual. When it concluded, Janet stood up. I hear you, and I understand. She took a deep breath. I haven't been listening enough in the past. Her voice was steady, sincere. Starting today, I want to work with you to make changes. She glanced around the room, looking each department head in the eye. I need your support to turn today's words into real action. The department heads exchanged glances. Some nodded, others remained silent. Janet didn't expect instant trust, but she had laid the foundation for something new. Leading by example. Leaving the meeting, Janet decided to visit the emergency department, a place she rarely went unless there was a major issue. The moment she entered, she was struck by the chaos. The beeping of machines, the shouts of nurses calling for help, the frustrated murmurs of patients. In the center of the room, Emily Turner was helping an elderly patient move from a hospital bed to a wheelchair. Janet noticed Emily signaling for assistance, but everyone was too busy. Without hesitation, Janet stepped forward. "Let me help," she said, her voice firm. Emily turned, eyes wide with surprise. "Mrs. Miller, you want to help?" "Yes," Janet replied, steadying the wheelchair. "You focus on the patient. I'll make sure nothing goes wrong." Both Emily and the patient seemed bewildered, but Janet remained patient. Together, they managed to get the patient seated safely. When they were done, Emily stared at Janet, still in disbelief. "Are you serious about this?" she asked softly. Janet exhaled, her tone gentle yet resolute. "I don't know what I was thinking before." She paused, then added, "But now I know this is what needs to be done. If I want people to trust me, I have to start with the small things." Emily's expression softened. She didn't say much, but Janet could sense that a small part of the trust she had lost was beginning to return. That afternoon, Janet made a decision she never would have considered before. She would hold an open meeting, not just for doctors and nurses, but for everyone, from janitorial staff to security guards. Janet wanted to hear from every person who kept this hospital running. As employees trickled into the room, the air was thick with skepticism. Janet stood in the center, facing dozens of questioning eyes. "I know that in the past, many of you have felt unheard." She paused, letting her words settle. "I know I've focused too much on processes and forgotten that this hospital exists to serve people." Her gaze swept across the room. "Not just to our patients, but all of you." She took a deep breath. "Today, I'm here to listen. Tell me what you need, and I will do everything I can to make things better." A heavy silence filled the room. Then from the back, a voice spoke up. It was Richard, the elderly janitor. He stood up, his voice raspy but firm. "I've worked here for 30 years. This is the first time I've heard you say something like this." He narrowed his eyes, studying Janet. "If you're serious about changing, I'll believe you." His words broke the tension. Other employees began nodding. A few stepped forward to share their thoughts. As Janet listened, she felt something shift. The divide between herself and the staff, the barrier she had built over the years, was beginning to shrink. She knew this journey wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. An emergency puts everything to the test. The first rays of dawn broke over St. Mary's Hospital. Janet arrived earlier than usual, ready to continue her journey of transformation. She had prepared a new plan: to listen, to help, to rebuild trust. But before she could implement it, an urgent call from reception changed everything. "Mrs. Miller, we have an emergency." A hurried voice crackled over the phone. "There's been a major accident on the highway. Ambulances are bringing in dozens of patients. The emergency department is about to be overwhelmed." Janet froze. Then, taking a deep breath, she replied firmly, "I'll be right down." She had declared a commitment to change. Now she would have to prove it. A crisis unfolds at St. Mary's Hospital. "I'm here to help. Tell me what I can do," Janet said, her gaze resolute. Emily hesitated, then nodded. "We need more space. Some of the less critical patients can be moved upstairs. Can you coordinate with the other departments?" Without hesitation, Janet picked up the phone, calling department heads to free up beds on the upper floors and arrange for stable patients to be transferred. Within minutes, staff began moving patients, creating room for those needing urgent care. Just as the process started running smoothly, the first stretchers arrived. A man with a severe head injury groaned in pain. A young mother clutched her son tightly, visibly shaken. Janet approached the mother, kneeling to meet her tear-filled gaze. "Everything is going to be okay. Your son is being taken care of. We'll do everything we can to ensure you're both safe," Janet reassured her, her tone calm and soothing. The mother, tears brimming in her eyes, nodded. "Thank you. I'm so scared," she stammered. "You don't need to worry. Let us handle this." Janet gently placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, a change in leadership. As Janet stood up, she noticed Emily watching her, eyes filled with surprise. "I didn't think I'd see you doing this," Emily murmured. Janet smiled. "I'm not just trying, Emily. I need to do this. For you, for this hospital." Hours passed. The emergency department was inundated with patients, and staff worked tirelessly without pause. Janet stayed in the thick of it, helping triage patients, assisting nurses with supplies, and even cleaning up when necessary. She realized that leading a team meant becoming an integral part of it. Across the room, Dr. Mark Robinson was treating a patient with a fractured arm. His face glistened with sweat as his hands worked methodically. Janet approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Mark, have you eaten yet?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Mark looked up, startled. "No, but I'm fine. There's too much to do." "No, you need a break. I'll have someone else take over here," Janet said, leaving no room for argument. Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you," he said, stepping away for a much-needed rest. Janet watched him leave, feeling a sense of relief. Caring for my team is just as important as caring for our patients. By late afternoon, the chaos began to subside. Critical patients had been treated, while less urgent cases were directed to waiting areas or transferred upstairs. Janet's body ached, but her heart was full. For the first time in years, she felt she had truly contributed, not by issuing commands, but by immersing herself in the work alongside her team. A young nurse approached Janet as the situation stabilized. "You surprised me today, Mrs. Miller. We really needed to see this side of you." Janet smiled, exhaustion evident on her face. "I needed to see this side of myself too," she replied softly. A new beginning. That evening, back in her office, Janet didn't open her laptop as she usually did. Instead, she sat quietly by the window, gazing at the hospital grounds. The lights from the patient rooms shone brightly in the darkness, a poignant reminder that the work here never truly ended. Yet for the first time, she didn't feel burdened by it. She had faced a significant crisis and realized that leadership wasn't about control from above, but about being present and involved. Her eyes gleamed with determination as she stood. Today's crisis was just the beginning. She knew that to create lasting change, she would need to maintain what she had done, not just during emergencies, but every single day. And for the first time, Janet believed she could. Trust is not rebuilt overnight. The next morning, Janet arrived at St. Mary's Hospital with an unusual feeling. The way the staff looked at her had shifted. Gone were the avoidant glances. Instead, there was curiosity, a silent question lingering in their eyes. Could she really change? Janet didn't blame them for their doubt. She knew she needed to do more than just make promises. Her first step that day was to call a meeting with all the department heads. But this time, she didn't sit at the head of the table. She sat in the middle of the room, not with a clipboard, but with a notebook and an open mind. "Yesterday, we faced a major crisis," Janet began. "I'm proud of all of you and our entire team for getting through it together. But I realized something." She paused, letting her words settle. "We're not as prepared as we need to be. If we don't improve the way we work, these crises will keep happening. And next time, it could be worse. I need your help to understand what we can do to make this hospital not only function better, but become a place where people want to work and be cared for." The room fell silent. The department heads exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, Emily Turner, the head nurse, spoke up. "We need to start with the schedules. Right now, nurses and doctors are working too many hours. People are exhausted with no time for their families. If we don't ease the pressure, we're going to keep losing our best people." Mark Robinson nodded in agreement. "I concur. Yesterday, I saw colleagues so drained they could barely focus. If we don't address this soon, the consequences could be severe." Janet carefully noted each comment as the meeting continued. More issues were raised. A shortage of medical equipment, the need to improve communication between departments, the importance of a supportive work environment. As some department heads even pointed out that Janet's rigid leadership style had contributed to the hospital's problem. But Janet didn't argue. She just listened. When the meeting drew to a close, she stood up. "I know we can't fix everything in one day," she said, "but I'm committed to doing everything I can to improve things. You're not just my staff, you're my teammates. We'll do this together." The room was quiet for a long moment. A few people nodded in agreement, but Janet could see skepticism lingered. She didn't blame them. Trust couldn't be built with words alone. She would have to act. A hospital transformed. That afternoon, Janet approved a pilot program to reduce overtime hours for nurses and doctors. To make this possible, she requested the hiring of part-time staff to help share the workload. She also installed a new internal communication system to streamline coordination between departments, especially during emergencies. But Janet didn't stop there. She knew true change required addressing how the hospital treated staff, especially those often overlooked. So she organized a meeting exclusively for custodians, security guards, and receptionists, the people often considered support staff, but whose roles were vital. As Janet entered the small but cozy room, she didn't carry a clipboard, just a notebook. For the first time, she was ready to listen. A transformation at St. Mary's Hospital. "I feel like maybe we matter too." Richard's words moved Janet deeply. She realized that meaningful change didn't just come from grand reforms, but also from small acts, like taking the time to listen. But Janet didn't stop with the staff. She also wanted to understand patient experiences. She organized a meeting with long-term patients and their families to gather feedback. A young mother shared a story about her daughter. "My daughter was admitted with a chronic illness. One nurse cared for her so compassionately, but I could see how exhausted she was, barely able to stand. I think if the hospital took better care of its staff, they could take even better care of us." These words hit Janet like a dagger to the heart. She knew her responsibility wasn't just to improve patient care, It was to create an environment where employees felt supported and respected. A shift in culture. In the weeks that followed, Janet's reforms began to make a difference. Nurses smiled more in the hallways. Doctors no longer worked endless overtime. A sense of unity began to grow. One day, Emily Turner stopped by Janet's office. You're really changing things," Emily said. "I don't know what brought this about, but we appreciate it." Janet smiled. She knew this wasn't about proving herself to JD Vance or anyone else. She was doing it for herself, her team, and the patients she had sworn to serve. That evening, as Janet returned to her office, she found a letter from JD Vance waiting on her desk. In it, he wrote, "I've heard about what you're doing. I'm impressed. Keep up the good work. Change is never easy, but I believe you're capable of seeing it through." Janet folded the letter, her eyes filled with determination. She knew the journey had just begun, but she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. A milestone moment. Over time, St. Mary's Hospital underwent a remarkable transformation. The reforms initiated by Janet Miller didn't just revolutionize operations, they revived the spirit of the entire team. The once somber, stress-filled hallways now echoed with laughter and conversations. The healthcare staff no longer worked like machines. They worked as a family, united in overcoming challenges together. Janet was no longer confined to her office, isolating herself from others. Instead, she frequently roamed different departments, engaging with nurses, doctors, janitors, and patients alike. Gone were the days of her clutching a clipboard filled with endless task lists. Instead, she carried a small notebook where she recorded people's thoughts and stories. She understood that the strength of an organization wasn't solely in its efficiency, but in the connections and understanding between its people. One day, Janet received a notification. JD Vance would be visiting the hospital. Months had passed since his initial appearance. She recognized the visit as a critical milestone, not just to evaluate the reforms, but to prove that her team had made a real difference. The visit of JD Vance. That morning, Janet prepared meticulously, not with detailed reports or elaborate presentations, but by ensuring that every corner of the hospital reflected its newfound sense of community. She didn't want to showcase a facade of perfection. She wanted JD Vance to see the genuine essence of St. Mary's, a place brimming with life and hope. When JD Vance arrived, there was no fanfare or grand ceremony. Dressed in a simple suit, he walked into the main lobby with a quiet yet confident smile. Janet greeted him at the entrance, shook his hand, and led him on a tour of the hospital. They began in the pediatric ward, where Janet introduced him to the nurses and doctors. A young nurse named Megan shared, "Since the changes were implemented, my work feels so much more meaningful. The flexible schedule allows me to spend time with my family, which makes me more effective at my job. I truly appreciate what Mrs. Miller has done for us." JD nodded, glancing at Janet with approval. "This is exactly what I hoped for when I decided to invest in this place," he said. A new chapter for St. Mary's. In the emergency department, Janet introduced JD Vance to Emily Turner, a veteran nurse who had witnessed the hospital's transformation firsthand. Emily recounted, "I've worked here for over 20 years. There was a time when the stress felt unbearable, and I considered leaving. But now I feel heard and supported, not just by Mrs. Miller, but by the entire team. We work together like a family." JD smiled. "Leadership isn't about control, it's about service. What I see here at St. Mary's is a testament to that, and it's truly commendable." Janet didn't say anything, only nodded in agreement. She knew JD's praise wasn't just for her, but for the entire team. A standing ovation. That afternoon, JD Vance held a meeting with all the hospital staff in the large auditorium. The room was packed. The atmosphere was a mix of anticipation and excitement. When JD took the stage, the room fell silent. "When I acquired St. Mary's Hospital, I saw potential," JD began. "But that potential could only be realized through the right leadership and the spirit of collaboration. I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to Mrs. Janet Miller. She has not only transformed management, but also reshaped how we see each other. She's not just a leader, she's an inspiration." The applause was thunderous, prolonged as if it would never end. Janet, seated in the front row, felt her heart race. JD gestured for her to join him on stage. Janet hesitated briefly before rising to her feet, walking to the stage amidst the unceasing applause. Taking the microphone, she looked out at the crowded auditorium, the people she once regarded as subordinates, but now saw as companions. "I don't know what to say," Janet began, her voice trembling with emotion. "When I started this journey, I didn't realize how much I could change or be changed. I've learned that true transformation doesn't come from one person, but from unity and trust. I want to thank all of you for giving me this opportunity, for your patience, and for standing with me as we rebuilt St. Mary's. This isn't my achievement, it's ours." The audience rose to their feet. Applause echoed through the hall. Janet felt her eyes sting with tears, but she smiled. This moment wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had contributed to the change, a new beginning. St. Mary's was no longer just a hospital. It was a beacon of unity, empathy, and compassion. Janet Miller's journey wasn't just a lesson in leadership. It was proof that when we listen, adapt, and prioritize people, miracles happen.